One of the things I tell my guys all the time is, especially when they're getting into stories about how people have dissed them when they find out that they're registry. I say, well, it's the same thing when I go to a cocktail party and somebody says, "What do you do?" And I go, "I'm a clinical therapist and I work with registered sex offenders." Well, that's the last time we ever have a drink together, the stigma spreads no matter what. And it has a lot to do with people not wanting to face some of the realities about their own lives and their own experiences and the reality of the situation. I mean, people like to live in this myth that so-called registrants are the worst kind of possible monsters that have these uncurable or untreatable kind of problems and are the world's biggest threats. And that's just a myth, And so some people who can become a little bit more knowledgeable are not overly affected by that. Well, first of all, America's understanding or willingness to accept sex and sexuality is problematic. We have a lot of different areas that exploit sexuality in different kinds of ways, whether it's just TV movies, certainly the whole kind of porn industry, etc. So there's this kind of myth or denial about the way that we are willing and able to accept our own personal sexuality. Then you have the problem where one out of approximately every 4 or 5 women is going to be experiencing some form of sexual abuse. One out of every 6 or 7 males are going to be victims of some sort of sexual abuse. And so you have a fifth of your entire population that in many ways are traumatized and are trying to deal with that trauma in their own way. And let's say they're all dealing with it in the best possible way. That creates a kind of a terrible kind of situation. Then when that translates to politics, and as we heard on the Zoom meeting the other night, I was very, very impressed with that. It seemed like every one of the legislators that had proposed some sort of possible kind of law were dealing with a response from their populace. And while I didn't like their response, I was grateful to hear that that was the rationale. On my side, my myth is that all of these legislators are crazy fools that are just trying to punish all of my hardworking therapy guys. So I was glad to hear something kind of different. So then you have that whole political kind of experience. There's money obviously to be made by selling sexuality. And so there is this kind of disconnect when somebody misbehaves sexually and when somebody who has an opportunity to make money off of it is selling it in a different kind of way. You have some other, as far as I'm concerned, kind of horrible kind of experiences. You have, for instance, the whole initial rationale and purpose of the registry has been totally dissipated. The idea of the registry was to essentially get the names of some of the most dangerous possible perpetrators available to law enforcement so that if indeed some other horrible crime take place, they could use that as a basic source. And of course, over the years, part of it because of money, part of it because of politics, part of it because of trauma, part of it because of fear. You've had this registry build up to where it is now, where in many ways it's almost completely useless. Almost any law enforcement person will tell you that. And so as that grows and develops, all of those things keep developing, you have this tremendous fear. And as you might know, people don't deal well with fear when she deals with sex offenders because of her history of abuse. I don't blame her. It's just that she has the eyes and the ears of many people listening, but she's not talking in an objective way. I'm not talking in an objective way because I have another whole side of the coin. And that that confronts that kind of reality. For years, one of my good friends taught a social work class at St. Louis U, and I would always go in and do one of his 3 or 4 hour segments on sex offending. And one day when I went in, I started talking, and one of the students, after about the first 5 or 10 minutes, just started attacking me verbally about what I was saying. And I tried to kind of explain myself. And then finally, I told her, I said, if this is problematic for you, I think you might need to leave. And she did. And of course, then I realized, 1 out of 5 women, and she was one of the women that had been abused, and she wasn't really ready, willing, or able to hear me saying anything that she thought was defending her abuser. In the same way, a number of years ago, I worked very closely with a congregation, and that congregation had a couple guys who had come out of prison and were on the registry and wanted to become active members. And their board was very willing to develop this as kind of a special ministry, but they felt it was very important, obviously, to explain things to their whole congregation. And so I had a big meeting with everybody in the congregation one time, and then we were meeting a second time. And one of the things that, again, and I would put this as my fault, I have to remember I'm talking to a congregation of 200 people, men and women. How many of those people in that congregation have been victims of some sort of sexual abuse or assault? And what developed is a group of women who had all been abused or assaulted in their lives were incredibly open and Christian about it, and said that they were more than ready and willing to assist in the development of this ministry to registrants, but they felt that at the same time the congregation should develop a special ministry for those who had been abused. And the beauty of it is that congregation was so wonderful that they were able to develop these two whole different focuses, one for perpetrators in the past and one for victims in the past. It was one of the great times in my experience to be involved in developing therapies or ministries or whatever. You can see this history of abuse. You have again while sexual offending, if you will, has no niches. Poor, rich, black, white, male on male, male on female. It's across the board. But America has its own little separate kind of areas. And so in some of those different kind of areas, those kinds of cultural experiences are looked upon in many, many different ways. If you're white, rich, and privileged, whether you steal something, defraud somebody, or sexually offend them, you still have that privilege going for you. If you're coming from a different sector, maybe not so much. My groups were, although they were gender divided, we had black, white. We didn't separate by crime, charge, or age, and that was purposeful on my part. It was clear to many guys that there were certain guys in our groups who, if they would have been able to have a decent legal representation, that they would have probably never been there. So people are aware of all of those kind of things that stem from prejudice and fear and trauma. And those things all contribute to that myth. Now, one other really practical thing that you might be aware of is that many, many, many years ago, I'd have to go back and look at the exact year, when the Supreme Court looked at this particular issue of putting guys on the registry and restricting them in terms of residency, etc. One of the sources of their deliberations was called an academic article concerning the riskiness and the reoffense rate of sex offenders. And that particular article was strictly related to some of the most serious offenders in a particular area and their particular rate. And it wasn't an academic article, it was in something like Popular Psychology or something. And the judges used that as the source for their deliberations. And of course, one of the consequences has been the ongoing ability for guys to be put on the registry and further restrictions to be involved in it. So misinformation rooted in fear and worry and meeting the populace needs is part of that whole myth. The realization that not all sex offenders are the same in terms of their offense. That's probably one of the most common things, that everybody thinks they're all alike and that there's no possible ability for these guys to change, whether it's dealing with punishment by imprisonment or whether it's dealt with in terms of therapy. It's a lot of people can't or are unwilling to accept that people can change.